Um, Obviously over the last year we've seen an unprecedented rise all around the world of protest movements, from Lebanon to Chile to Haiti to Hong Kong to Bolivia, Ecuador, Algeria, Sudan, etc. And obviously we're going to have speakers to speak a little more in depth about some of those movements. But first I'd like to say a bit about why it's important for us to do, as socialists, as revolutionaries, to do international solidarity work. So I'm not an expert on Sudan. I never have been. I wasn't an expert on Sudan before I started doing solidarity work. If you want to speak about Sudan, then Raja is here, who we've worked with very closely. She can tell you a bit about the work that we've been supporting on the ground in Sudan through the Workers' Alliance for the Restoration of Trade Unions, who will also be raising money for at the end of this session. But what I want to talk about, instead of focusing explicitly on Sudan itself, is just a little bit about what work we did and why that is important to us revolutionaries to do international solidarity work. And now the obvious point in all this is actually, we do have to do international solidarity because we live in a global economy. Capitalism is a global system of exploitation, and we can't escape the fact that we can't escape the consequences of actions elsewhere in a global system. But crucially, capitalism is global but not undifferentiated, right? So it doesn't affect every place around the world in the same way. And importantly, it's differentiated by the relations of imperialism. Capital and business are tied to different states, and this leads to massive economic power imbalances, with entire economies modelled towards production of economies for foreign markets, but also wars when the balance of these unequal relationships is threatened. And for this reason, we can't just talk straightforwardly, as we might like, about insurgency around the world, as if we can cut and paste lessons from anywhere, or imply that a global movement could ever have the same demands. But in this context, then we think about international solidarity. That's about identifying and developing points of contact. Thinking about how do our enemies here in Britain help the enemies of the movement we're trying to be in solidarity with? What tactical alliances exist between the ruling class here and in, say, Sudan, in Iraq, etc., in Ecuador, in Chile? We could ask ourselves, for instance, is the British state currently supplying arms to a movement which is cracking down on a movement we're in solidarity with? Is British foreign policy dependent on repression elsewhere? And when we think in this way, we also start to see that imperialism is not just something that happens to the global south, it's something inflicted on the global south by the global north. Imperialism also shapes the way our state operates and the way repression operates in our state. And a good example of this is, for instance, since the beginning of the war on terror, certainly since the war in Iraq, the massive expansion of counter-terrorism in this country and the repressive models of counter-terrorism, and especially the way in which that affects particularly racialized populations here, particularly Muslims. But also, more generally, and for far longer, just the border regime, which, as we know, is a hostile environment as a function, largely, of imperialist conflicts abroad, has enjoyed massive beefing up, massive securitization, massive militarization of our border regime here. And so, part of the reason, as I say, why I'm showing this section is because I've been involved in Aris from Lyon's international solidarity work with Sudan last year. And so I'll talk a bit about that now. So practically in our Sudan solidarity work, we did three things. We passed motions of the British trade union movement, we raised funds for works in Sudan, and we built contacts with the Sudanese diaspora. But crucially, international solidarity isn't simply about repeating demands from other people. We need to think, as political actors here, and make an assessment about how we can best make an intervention. Not least because the movements we're in solidarity with necessarily are made up of lots of different political tendencies. For instance, many voices last summer, alongside a lot of Western NGOs, were calling for things like the UK government to act in Sudan, calling on British MPs to raise issues in Parliament, or calling for things like the prosecution of war criminals in the International Criminal Court. And obviously there are problems with, as internationalists, as socialists, there are often problems with all of these approaches in as much as they tend to rely on appeals to the same institutions which are responsible for British hegemony, global imperialism, as well. And so we didn't obviously openly oppose these demands, but we sought to work solidaristically within the wider movement. But we sought to foreground demands which highlighted the complicity of the British government, such as EU funding of the Janjaweed militia, who were responsible for massive crackdowns on the protests, including the deplorable massacre of over 100 people of the sit-in June 3rd last year, who were funded, the Janjaweed funded for border enforcement for the EU's external borders in Africa, through something called the Khartoum process, which was held in Rome in 2014. And we tried to raise awareness of British involvement in the war in Yemen, for instance, where Sudanese militias are employed fighting for the Saudi-led coalition. We tried to make sure that opposition to these elements of British complicity was embedded in British support for the revolution through the motions we passed and the banners and leaflets we took demonstrations. Another major aspect of what we did was to raise money for Sudanese workers. The revolution involved an enormous general strike and over 90% compliance across various sectors of the economy. But the vast majority of workers in Sudan are ununionised, generally because the vast majority of trade unions in Sudan are state-controlled, highly bureaucratised, with minimum cut-off points for union representation, so thousands of workers receive no union representation. We raised funds for the Workers' Alliance to make sure that funds exist to help organisers build rank and file for unions, transport costs of organisers, and for strike funds so they have some political independence and can strike independently of the large bureaucratic unions. And this is also doubly important for us because it connects to our own struggle against trade union bureaucracy here and building rank and file trade unions. And finally, we also worked to build links with the Sudanese diaspora here in Britain. And we're very lucky last summer that actually the Sudanese diaspora is comparatively very well organised in Britain. They were able to turn out thousands of people onto the streets of London for protests most weeks. And we worked with the Sudanese Doctors' Union to put on an exhibition of street art from around the city in Khartoum and to commemorate the massacre on the 3rd of June, as well as the incredible resolve of Sudanese workers and revolutionaries. And over 2 days we hosted it. About 500 to 700 people visited the exhibition, took leaflets from the Workers' Alliance, and talked about anti-imperialism, etc. So I say all of these points to demonstrate how the practice of international solidarity always has effects both ways. How we benefit from it, and what it teaches us about our own states, what common struggles we share, and potential solutions to our common problems. The practice of international solidarity, as well as building international collections, also allows us to educate the wider movement here on the realities of our own situation, to build against the border regime, to build against counter-terrorism, and of course to draw inspiration from the incredible struggles of people across the world fighting for emancipation. But crucially, we must always keep complicity of our own government in the frame, because this is what helps us to draw connections, to identify common enemies, and most importantly, it guards us against sleepwalking into a politics which sees the actions of our government, their bombs and their trade wars, as potential solutions to the problems abroad.